welcome everyone, and I'm glad to see a few people came into the front row. I was getting a bit worried that I might have no friends left at all. It is a real privilege and a real honour to be here and to share a few thoughts with you about the second of our dual moral purposes. Yesterday we focused really wonderfully on the importance of us as leaders leading the educational journey of our school communities. But today my focus is to take the other side of Caesar's coin and to really look quite deeply at what's part of our role in the spiritual domain of our leadership. I entitled the presentation Desert Travellers because if you're the only person in the room that doesn't know that I'm just back from a pilgrimage in the footsteps of St. Paul, I had the privilege of going with 40 of our emerging leaders with Cardinal Pell, and we went to Athens and to Turkey and on to Rome, and we did slip up to Assisi for a couple of days. Even though people said St. Paul didn't go to Assisi, I said I don't care, the executive director wants to go to Assisi, so we went. And it was a most incredible journey. And I deliberately left the preparation of this conference presentation until after that experience, because I had a sense in my bones that the desert travellers, as I call them, the people that followed in the footsteps of St. Paul, would give us as leaders some inspiration. I'd like to just set the context a little bit for today. And in part of setting the context, I was reflecting back to one of the first principal conferences I went to 25 years ago. And there's a few people in the audience here that were probably with me on that conference. And I'd just like to show you the fashions that were evident at the conference 25 years ago. It was more indicative. Superannuation and retirement wasn't on the scene at that point. But quite seriously, why I'm reflecting on this particular conference was at the conference, we were all gathered. It was nowhere near as salubrious as this, I might say. We were all gathered, and the CEO had invited out an American presenter who was an expert at the time in HR. And in those days, not a lot had been done in terms of human resource management and the impact on leadership. And this American woman came up to the stand and, you know, put down her things, no PowerPoints, you know, a little bit of a overhead projector. And she just walked out to the front of the group and she said, "Do you know what is wrong with you Catholic principles?" And we're all going. She said, "No, do you know what's wrong with Catholic principles?" And we're getting a bit antsy by this, you know, we're ready to, you know. And she said, "I'll tell you what's wrong with Catholic principles. You're all too bloody nice." And 25 years later, I still remember that moment, because what she was saying was that we didn't have the courage to challenge underperforming teachers in our schools. We were always wanting to have happy families. And she said, you know, our Catholic ethos had sort of put this bubble around us that made us relate to people in a different way. And we created this illusion that being authentic leaders were being leaders that were well liked, rather than leaders that were prepared to challenge in the interests of children. And so I want to paraphrase that 25 years on. Principles look a little bit different 25 years down the track. Somber look, aren't they? But I want to ask a little bit of what the same question. Do you know, and I sincerely believe this, what is wrong with Catholic principles today? You know what I think our greatest challenge is today? I think we run the risk of being, excuse the French, too bloody complacent when it comes to the spirituality of our mission. Now, just before you all mutiny, I want to give you a little bit of a context for why I'm saying that. Over the last 10 years, the educational context of Catholic schools, particularly in New South Wales, has improved incredibly. I was at our Sydney Archdiocesan Catholic Schools Board the other night, and they were looking at one of these enrolment graphs. And there were a couple of new people on the board, and one of the people said, well, why is it that the enrolments have improved so much, so dramatically in the last few years? And as we started to answer, we said, well, there's some demographic growth, but there's also, there's been a huge improvement in our facilities. We've had the BER, sorry secondary principals, but the primary principals, we've had the BER. We've had a wonderful lift in the quality and the fabric of our schools. But most importantly, I said, our educational standard has risen. Our NAPLAN results for Catholic schools in New South Wales far exceeds any state or national averages. Our HSC results, and I'm probably generalising from my diocese, but our HSC results last year were the best ever achievement of Catholic school kids in the higher school certificate. We have done a fabulous job, but I contend on my Caesar's coin that as we've tried to really build capacity in one area, sometimes we're not quite as focused in the other. And I don't think the complacency is ours alone. I believe there's an incredible complacency in the Catholic Church. While I was overseas, you get those opportunities to explore the church from different dimensions. I think we all know the situation that's happened in Ireland. The fabric of the Catholic community in Ireland has been eroded seriously because, critically, sadly, there was more than a complacency about how we addressed really critical issues of child welfare. But a lot of my time was spent in Turkey. And it was amazing going to sites in Turkey, which was really the roots, the springs of the early Christian church. And then to be in a country where we were having mass in a hotel one night, and I was a little bit conscious that the hymns we were singing were going out into the dining area downstairs in a Muslim country. And I wondered how that would have been felt by people. To know that in Turkey today, that after Constantinople was the heart of the Christian church, that there are only 45 Catholic priests. To hear the story about how only not so long ago the bishop in Turkey was assassinated by his driver. I did say to Cardinal Pell, he needs to watch out when I'm driving him around schools. He better be nice to me. But the church is under incredible threat. Little picture up there on the bottom. We went to the church of St. Peter and St. Paul, and you went up a road behind a little gate down a hallway. The church was totally blocked, if you like, from any public sense of view. And yet you go inside, and I just tried to capture it in the picture. It was beautiful, ancient and beautiful, and hidden. And the priests that came out were so pleased to see 40 pilgrims. We were the biggest group for Mass that he'd had all year. His average congregation was 30 people. Then in France, I spent some time in France, and I spoke to the rector of one of the seminaries, and we were just sharing what we were doing here in Sydney, and so he said, you've got no idea how far ahead your Catholic schools are to our situation in France, because the schools are totally integrated into the education system. He said, we've lost our sense of true mission. So in one way, I was celebrating. Sorry, that death by 1,000 cuts got lost in the thing. But in another way, I was aching. I was aching for our church. And you know, our reality here in Australia is heading down some of those tracks. We know from the Catholic Life surveys about mass attendance. We know that only about 13% of any school community will have, on average across Australia, families involved with the worshipping parish life. One parish that I was involved in, Tasmania, the priest told me there was not one family in the school that were practicing in the parish. We're waiting next month for the 2011 figures. I wonder what the trend will be from there. And yet we also know, and keep in mind in the graph up there for 0 to 14, we don't measure mass attendance for children in the same way. But we know that there's still a very stable belief structure, that the majority of our young people still believe, but they don't practice. But I think the thing that's really struck me, and there was a wonderful little article just last week entitled, "We've developed a generation of Catholics but." You know, yes, I'm Catholic, but I, don't agree with the church on, you pick an issue. I found it a wonderfully interesting experience working with the best of our best young leaders, our Year 12 captains, who come together each year, meet with the Cardinal to help form some ideas around for the Cardinal's Pentecost statement. These are wonderful young people. But you can see, whatever the topic is, last year it was euthanasia, their whole understanding of these topics is about relativism. You know, they say, well, yes, that's the Catholic view, but if somebody else got another view, that's okay. You know, like we can accommodate any view, rather than to say, no, as Catholics, we have a very deep understanding of these things. And it was quite interesting through the seminar to listen to the young people talk about their views on euthanasia at the beginning, and then they had a wonderful presentation from a Catholic doctor, and you could see they were widened in their understanding. Our challenge is to how do we address the Catholic buts? So in my mind, we're at that stage in our church journey where we have to face some realities. We can't just be complacent and just let the erosion continue. But then the next thing is, are we asking the right questions? We were privileged on our trip, 40 of us, with the Cardinal, to meet with the Congregation for Catholic Education. That's quite a significant honour. We met Cardinal Zion. He was only there briefly because he got whisked off to see the Pope about some urgent matter. But we met with the congregation. And as we were meeting, there was a bit of a dialogue. We said, well, what's happening in other countries? And you know, the sort of issues were really big picture, sweeping generalisations. You know, the big challenge for Catholic schools is Catholic identity. Well, everyone can agree about that, but what does that really mean underneath? So I took the advice last night and I thought, well, I'll ask. And when I went on to Wolfram, I put in solutions for new evangelisation. And I know it's hard to read from the back, but it came back and said, Wolfram Alpha doesn't understand your query, and then proceeded to give me a lesson. Oh! Yep. It proceeded to give me a lesson in visual depth. Proceeded to give me a lesson on equation solving. our challenge is we're not sure that we're asking the right questions. However, I think there are light in the windows. I do believe that when our Catholic bishops in New South Wales had a go at Catholic schools at the crossroads, they started to unpack some of the questions that we need to look at. But out of all the questions, and this is a very long-winded introduction, but out of all the questions that I think we were asked in Catholic schools at the crossroads, if I had to prioritise them, if I had to say, I'm on a mission to address at least one of these questions, I believe our greatest complacency, when that works, can you just, yep, our greatest complacency, no, it's not going to work on here, is our formation of staff. As much as I believe every person in this room places a huge priority on this issue, I'm not sure we're digging into it in the right level and depth that we could. So taking that a little bit further, I was really heartened at the end of the meeting with the congregation. No, we've gone too far now. To realise that in New South Wales in particular, that unlike some other countries that they were sharing with us, we're not a deficit model. The challenge I'm putting out to you is not just to make you uncomfortable, because I really believe that we are encountering a religious and secular world which is dividing so quickly that Catholic schools over the last 40 years have done more and more and more and more to try and close the gap. But it's almost like the harder we work, the bigger the gap becomes. So my comments today are not directed in terms of saying we're not having a real go. And that's what was impressive at the end of our meeting with the congregation. The woman who then chaired the meeting said to me afterwards, she said, you know, most groups come into the congregation and tell us about their problems. You guys have come in and shared some solutions. And I was really heartened by that. But I just want to stop, just to pause for reflection, and I just want to put this simple question to you. What percentage of time, effort and resources do you, your leadership team, put into the spiritual formation as distinct from maintenance? I'm talking about formation. Maintenance is when you have a staff prayer at the beginning of a staff meeting. What do you put into formation of your teachers? And in fact, I say staff because I'm a great believer in everyone on staff being part of it, relative to the time, effort and resources allocated to forming the learning community that we were talking about yesterday. Put it in percentage terms. Is it 50-50? 60-40? Just pick a figure. Have a think about it for a minute, and then just maybe share with the person next to you. What percentage of your time, effort and resources, the full package, are you actually putting into staff spiritual formation? Have a buzz for a minute. If I was Alan November, I would now have this really sophisticated little thing where you can dial in on your laptops and your phones. But I'm a bit more basic than that. I just want you to put up your hand. Who would say that their balance between the amount of time, effort and money they put into building the learning community and the spiritual community of staff is about 50-50? Who would say 40% for spirituality, 60% for learning? You've got a job in my place. Who would say 30-70? 30% for spirituality, 70%. 20-80. Getting closer. 10%, 90. I'll close my eyes. Look, that's a reality. We know that's a reality. But can I say to you, we are very fortunate in Australia that we do not take full funding from the government. When I was in Ontario, I met with my counterpart, Sister Joan, a very feisty little Irish nun. And I tell you what, you wouldn't want to get on her bad side in an argument. And she would go around the Catholic schools, because the schools were really run, even though they had Catholic boards, they were fully accountable for every dollar they spent to the state government, the province government. And she was like Brian Croke in our state as the director at the state level, but who had no governance responsibility, couldn't really tell a director or a principal how to spend the budget, but had a moral purpose. And she would visit the schools, and you know, they'd have a cup of tea, and she just said, "Can you show me your budget?" And she'd often say to the principal, "Show me your budget and I'll show you your commitment to staff formation." And it often rings in my head when we're doing the system budgets. You know, how much are we actually putting into staff formation? While I was in Paris, I had the opportunity of just touching base with a book that I'd read many years earlier, but really didn't know much about. But many of you would recognise The Little Prince. And in The Little Prince, it was written by Anton, I can never pronounce his surname, Saint-Exupéry or something like that. But he was a famous French aviator. In 1935, he had a crash in the desert. And the story of The Little Prince was a reflection of his journey out of the desert, injured, dying of thirst, the way he was rescued, and so on. But he had this wonderful little quote, which is one of the reasons why I really like the concept of calling us desert travellers. He talks about the stars in the desert. He says, all people have stars, but they aren't the same. For desert travellers, the stars are guides. For other people, they're nothing but tiny lights. And I think about that in terms of our Catholic spirituality. And I wonder, where are our stars in the desert when it comes to the formation of people? And I suppose as I came to learn a little bit more about St. Paul during this journey, came to that deeper understanding how very much in our Judeo-Christian tradition we look to deserts and we look to mountains as the points of inspiration in our lives. But what was interesting about St. Paul, as it says in the Acts, and I'd never really thought about it, you know, it's one of these things that you read and you just read over it. We hear about St. Paul having this great conversion experience on the road to Damascus, and we go, oh wow, you know, he suddenly had an experience of the crucified and risen Christ. But what's little known, or little referred to, is that after St. Paul had that experience, he didn't just suddenly go out and start preaching about Jesus Christ. He didn't suddenly go back to Jerusalem to meet the apostles. He went to Arabia. He went to the desert. And there was a period of 2 to 3 years of formation where he was so well educated within the Jewish tradition that he had to totally reprocess a whole belief structure. And whilst the initial inspiration might have happened at a special moment, he knew that he couldn't give that out until he had some formation. And it was 2 to 3 years of formation before he presented himself to the apostles in Jerusalem. We come from a tradition where we're the generation after the religious leaders in our schools, who had the gift and the privilege of an extended formation in novitiates and so on, and an ongoing formation as well. I was at a beginning treat for our beginning teacher retreat the other day, and I couldn't help thinking, what was the formation that we've given to this next generation of teachers spiritually before they've gone into the classroom? I don't think 2 or 3 years would really cover it. I entitled the talk Desert Travellers Inspiring a Radical Minority for a particular reason. You know Covey's stuff. We could sit here as Catholic educators and we could focus on our areas of concern. I was mapping some of those things out. You can paint a really bleak picture. Or we could take the Covey approach and say, well, look, there are some things that we can't do much about. But there is circles of influence. There are things that are within our sphere as Catholic leaders that we can do something about, that we can touch. And I believe staff formation is one of those areas that's a great challenge, but it's within our circle of influence. And that's why when we read Hattie's stuff, I'm always interested as an educational leader in what are the big ticket items, what are the things that make a real difference to building teacher capacity. And one of the secrets of Hattie is to back 2 or 3 things that you know are the really higher impact things rather than doing 20 things that have got low impact. I would love to do some research on what are the things that are the really high impact things around Catholic identity, our mission and our formation of staff. And we've got to start picking on those to really make that difference. Because I think sometimes we skim over the surface with our approach to formation rather than hone in on 3 or 4 things. And so what I'd like to do in the second half of this presentation is to share with you some of my reflections on what I might put in the zone of desired effects. And so I'm going to talk about identifying the markers that are left by the desert travellers that might give us some signposts about what we can do as Catholic leaders to really build staff capacity in the spiritual sense as distinct from the educational sense. And I love the concept of the markers because if you ever go through the desert, I remember the opening shot that I had was the walk that you do from Jerusalem down to Jericho through the wilderness area. And as you're going on that walk through the desert, they've put high up on the tips of the mountains crosses. And if you get disoriented or you get a little bit lost, you'd always look up and you say, ah. And boy, when we did that walk, did we get lost quite a few times. What are the markers? And so I want to share with you 10 markers that I think our desert travellers have left for us. Now, I warn you now, there is a test at the end of this. Those that can get 10 out of 10 will get a special prize at the superannuation stand. I have to promote superannuation, unlike others. Okay, the first one, marker 1. There is a well in every desert. As the Little Prince says, what makes the desert beautiful is that it hides a well somewhere. I had an amazing experience a few years ago when I was on the National Catholic Commission, visiting Catholic schools in remote areas of Australia, but particularly on this trip out in the Kimberley. They put us in a plane, they flew us 1,000 kilometres into the desert. We touched down, and as we drove into the little settlement, my heart absolutely sank. The poverty, the not the despair of the people, just the bleakness, you know, like the sitting, just that sense of giving up, the filth. The whole town was just like going into some terrible third world country. And I thought, what have we come to here? Until they drove us into the Catholic school. And the Catholic school was literally and figuratively an oasis in the desert. Beautifully cared for, incredibly maintained, even had a lawn in the middle of the yard. The place was clean, kids were fed, technology was there. I was so proud to be a Catholic educator to see that our colleagues, and in this case Western Australia, had pulled out everything they could do to make a really safe and secure place for those children to learn. I think our Catholic schools in New South Wales are wells in the desert. This particular well we found on that Good Samaritan walk. We were lost. Never give a Western Australian principal a map. They'd read them upside down, I found. And we were lost, and we literally stumbled over this. And then we realised that this was a little well that Jesus would have stopped at on the way up from Jericho to Jerusalem, and where that whole line from St. John's Gospel comes from. You know, when in John's Gospel he says, "The water that I will give will become in them a spring of water, gushing up to eternal life." I think our schools are a great starting point in this desert spirituality that so many of our families are. But to build the well is not enough. It's the start. But we can't just content ourselves that we've created some lovely wells. So we've got to go to the marker 2. And my marker 2 is, do we as leaders seek out the sub-apostles? When I was in Turkey, I was introduced to a saint that I knew absolutely nothing about, Saint Polycarp. Now, I'm sure there's some people here that would know everything about Saint Polycarp, but I knew zip, nil, nothing. I almost mispronounced his name a couple of times, and that got me into real trouble. But Saint Polycarp was one of the first, what they call the sub-apostles, the leaders of the church that immediately came after the apostles and had been formed by the apostles. And so St. Polycarp was formed by St. John. But what was interesting as you read Polycarp's story is obviously he wasn't a Christian when he first met John, but John sought out people that had a spirituality. At that stage it wasn't a Christian spirituality, but he looked for depth in people. He looked for qualities in people that had a spiritual domain. Who do you look for on your staff that has that really deep potential spirituality? They mightn't be fully formed, but do we really seek them out and try and identify them? Because what was interesting about Polycarp's story, and he lived till he was 86, but one of the things in his story was that during the second generation of Christians, there were incredible fights about things like the timing of Easter, fights about the celebration of the Eucharist, and there were heresies started to spring up. And Polycarp said, this was his quote, whenever the fight started, he said, there's only one answer. Be true to the life of Jesus and imitate that life. Who are the sub-apostles on your staff where when you look at them, you get that sense they are imitating the life of Jesus? Look for them. St. Ignatius commented on Polycarp. He said, your mind is grounded in God as on an immovable rock. And when they took him to martyr him at the age of 86 and to burn him, you know, he would not renounce Christianity because he said, what else can I say? Christ is Christ, and I love him. I have a sense that we are, as Catholic leaders, very privileged because in a way we're the sub-apostles. 400 steps removed maybe. When I was in Rome, I was very honoured to be introduced to Pope Benedict. And when I got back, a lot of my staff said, that must have been a really exciting moment. And at a human level, it was. You know, you don't get to meet the Pope that often in your life. It's one of your bucket list type of things. But when I was meeting the Pope Benedict, whilst the human part was there, my overwhelming feeling was being connected to a story that went back 2,000 years. We'd just come out of St. Peter's Basilica, and we have to boast here. We had Mass in the crypt just near St. Peter's tomb. We came up into the Basilica and we had the entire Basilica to ourselves beforehand. No tourists, a most amazing experience. We came out the door of the front of the Basilica and there was the general audience, thousands of people. And you had this sense, as I met Pope Benedict, of being connected to that Peter. It was a wonderful moment. Our job, I think, is to make those connections, to identify those sub-apostles and then connect them in to this journey. I must tell you a story. This is an aside. I should tell the video person to turn it off. After I was introduced, my wife was introduced to Pope Benedict. And the Cardinal had said a couple of nice things about Catholic schools, and Pope Benedict had said nice things to me about Catholic schools. And then my wife came up, and you know, she was quite serious and quite nervous, as you would be. And the Pope just took a hand, looked at me, looked at her, and said, with great sympathy and empathy, "You have been married a very long time, haven't you?" And when you see the pictures, my wife goes from really serious to really low. So our Pope has a sense of humour as well, at my expense. Okay. Marker 3. I've told this story before, but one thing that really struck me was how important it is not just to identify the sub-apostles, but to back the winners. Before the pilgrimage started, we'd sent out an invitation to Catholic principals in our diocese to nominate emerging leaders that they feel might be interested in going on this pilgrimage. And we were sort of thinking, you know, the 30 to 40 age group, you know, people that were just knocking at the door to leadership or in their first leadership experience. We turned up at the first orientation session and there was a wonderful cross-section of people, and then there were these 3 or 4 really, really young teachers, like 2nd year out, 3rd year out. And I'm thinking, hang on, I don't think that principal's read the criteria very well. But you know, having spent a month with those young people, I really came to that understanding. That was a principal that backed a winner, saw potential in that young person, and to see them grow over that time was amazing. And I suppose that's why I often use the analogy of the 100 monkey syndrome. For those of you not familiar with the story of the 100 monkeys, it's a great story in itself. Off the coast of Japan, there's a series of islands. And they're uninhabited. They're sort of almost like little coastal islands. And on the islands, there's troops of monkeys, and it's pretty undisturbed sort of virgin territory. So naturalists go there to study the monkey behaviour. Anyway, on this one occasion, the naturalist was watching the monkeys and how they feed. And the monkey had climbed the tree, and they'd get the paw of the coconut, and they'd knock it down, and it'd fall down, and it'd break open on the ground, and then the monkey would climb down and eat it. And this was their established behaviour. They'd done it for hundreds, thousands of years. Anyway, one day, the naturalist just watching, the monkey knocked the paw off the tree, and it fell down, and instead of falling on the sand and the rock, it actually fell into a little stream. And the monkey climbed down and picked up the pawpaw out of the stream and tentatively started to eat it, and then wolfed it down because it tasted a lot better without sand and rock and grit and that all over it. What was interesting was that the next day, the same monkey climbed the tree and this time deliberately flicked the pawpaw so it fell into the stream. And the naturalist observed this behaviour for 3, 4, 5 days and then realised that this monkey had learned a new behaviour. And that was interesting in itself, until the next week another monkey in the troop imitated that same behaviour. And progressively over about 6 weeks, the number of monkeys on the island, and there were thousands of them, the number of monkeys on the island that started to adopt this new behaviour grew in 1s and 2s, until after about 6 weeks, the naturalists observed there were about 100 monkeys that had learnt this new behaviour. But the amazing thing was, the next day, almost literally overnight, the full colony of monkeys, 3,000 monkeys right across the island, adopted the behaviour. It's what we know is about nurturing a critical mass. Are we nurturing the 100 monkeys in our staff? Are we picking the winners, the people that will be the initiators, the faith-filled, passionate people? And you start to understand it when you look back through our own history. When in Rome we did the pilgrimage of Mary MacKillop, and what I didn't know until we did that pilgrimage was just how incredibly supportive the Jesuits were of Mary MacKillop. There she was, a young woman, totally out of her depth, you know, in Rome by herself, couldn't even live as a nun. She had to pretend because the secular world in Rome at that stage was so anti-Christian. But the Jesuits did incredible things. They must have seen some gift in Mary that they nurtured during that 18 months or so that she was in Rome. And then we go up to Assisi. It's the same story. We all know the story of St. Francis, but it's the role the Benedictines played in backing this young, what some people would have thought crazy guy, and saying, we can see something in that person that's worth nurturing. That's marker 3. So you know there's 7 to go, and we can pace ourselves accordingly. Let's talk about marker 4. I call it discover the altar of the unknown God. As in all of these experiences, each time we went to different places on our pilgrimage, we'd try and find the reading that corresponded to where we were. And so when we went to Athens, we were very much attracted to go up to the, I can never pronounce it, the Areopagus. And that's that sort of rock just down below the Acropolis where the Council of Elders in Athens used to meet. And it was like almost where they'd discuss affairs of state, but it was also where criminal matters were heard and so on. Well, when St. Paul arrived in Athens, he went through the city and he then went up to address the council. And so we all dutifully climbed up the rock like good tourists. But our reflection on that day was that wonderful reading from St. Paul where he spoke to the council and he said, "Men of Athens, I have seen for myself how extremely scrupulous you are in all religious matters. Because I noticed as I strolled round admiring your sacred monuments that you had inscribed an altar to an unknown God. Well, the God whom I proclaim is in fact the one whom you already worship without knowing it. I think one of our challenges is to help people discover the altar of the unknown God. And by that I mean we need to meet people where they are, but be very clear that we're taking them on a journey. I put the little babushka dolls there, and some of you have heard me speak about the babushka dolls before, but for those that haven't, we have a program in Sydney called Family Educators, and it's gradually expanding, rolling out to each of our schools, where it's a 0.5 appointment of a person whose role is to connect the parish, the school and families together and really nurture evangelisation in that context. When we're forming these people, and I remember the first group when they came in after working for 12 months, we were listening to their stories. I shared with them the metaphor of the babushka doll. And you all know how the dolls work, and I could tell you the whole story of babushka. But what most people don't realise is that the tiny little doll in the middle of the babushka doll, in the tradition, represents the infant Jesus. That hidden inside each person is Christ. And that's the metaphor of the babushka doll. But you don't find Christ by jumping straight to the middle. You have to gradually unpack. You have to meet people where they are and go through the layers until you find the Christ within. And I know one of the family educators said to me, now I get it. She went into the parish community so full of zeal that she wanted everyone to meet the infant Jesus before she had met them where they were. And you know, so one of the first things we did following that meeting is that we bought every family educator a coffee machine. And part of the model is invite them in for coffee, build community. Then if you're going to have a prayer and coffee, and work your way gradually into the layers. Well, you know, I think as principals, we need, with our staff, to recognise that we've got to find the altar of the unknown God. We talk about differentiating for our students. We don't think too much about differentiating our faith formation programs for our staff. To my great embarrassment, I shouldn't tell stories about myself, but in my zeal in Tasmania, we had a staff development day for the office, and we had this great theologian. We actually had a theologian in residence that worked with us, and he was an expert on iconography. And I'm quite intrigued by iconography and the spirituality of it. Well, we had a staff development day on iconography. Well, there were about 6 of us on staff that thought it was the best day we've ever had. But there were about 6 young girls, young secretaries on the staff, that were going, what have you done to us? You know, like it just went whoosh over their head. And yet so often we'll organise a staff spirituality day where we don't think, well, how do we, you know, do we put any variety? Do people have any choices about learning within that day? Yes, there's common experiences, but you know, do we actually realise that our staff are at different places, but at the same time be keen to take them somewhere? Marker 5. Introduce the boss's son. One of the great things about travelling with Cardinal Pell on the journey was that for most of us, we only see the Cardinal when he's in the official role. And to have him travelling on the bus with these young teachers, we saw a real human side to him and a great sense of humour. And we were privileged often with his homilies to hear a little bit of, instead of him talking, you know, formally from a pulpit, you know, more of a dialogue. Anyway, on this one particular day, he was getting us to reflect on what we would say to St. Peter when we died and we arrived at the pearly gates. And he said, you know, would you say, in our context, look, Peter, I've been a Catholic school principal for 25 years. I've got 2 master's degrees, I've got the scars to prove it, I've given my insides for Catholic education? Or would you prefer to say, I'm a mate of the boss's son? And his point was very simple, that all the external trappings and degrees and awards and work and that we do is meaningless if we're not friends with the boss's son. And the little picture there was when we were at Ephesus. And to go to the ancient ruins of Ephesus is fantastic in itself. But to the side of Ephesus is what we call Mary's house. It's a site of great devotion. I know some of you have been there. And tradition has it that when St. John looked after Mary and John went on his journey, Mary went with him. And tradition has it that Mary lived in Ephesus. And they've excavated and they found this old ruin and then rebuilt what people believe is Mary's house. Now, I think as Australians, we're pretty cynical, you know, like saying, well, hang on, you know, how do we know this is really Mary's house? But you know what struck me when we had Mass there and when I went to pray in that house, I thought, you know, that doesn't matter. There was a devotion and a gentle spirituality of thousands of people because they wanted to be connected to the mother of the boss's son. And I couldn't help, out of all the things, and I've said this to many of my colleagues, they said, oh, what were the highlights of the trip? You know, out of all the incredible things we did, the moment of prayer I had in Mary's house was one of the most touching. And it was in that sense of prayer and thinking about what are some of these markers that I became even more convinced that we need to help our staff get to know the boss's son. Who found marker 1? Who found marker 1 was the one that they nominated as one of the challenges? None? Okay, I'll delete that from the next presentation. No, and I didn't expect it because I think that's what we do very well. Marker 2. Marker 2, seek out the sub-apostles. Thank you. And you know, when I talk to people about it, particularly secondary schools, it's really tough to sometimes find those people. Primary schools, as principals, we get a different connection with staff. But in secondary schools, you've really got to look for them a little bit to find them. What about marker 3? Back the winners. Back the winners. If you picked your winners, often say to you right now, write down on your pad one young person on your staff who you would back into the future. Picture that person. Have you got somebody, some of you got many, but have you got somebody on your staff that you really think that in 25 years' time, not that they're just going to be a principal, but they're going to be, in their own way, a really dynamic spiritual presence in the school community? And if you can think of that person now, what are you doing to back them? I remember when I first came over from state education to Catholic education, a wonderful nun at the school who, the principal, Sister Winifred. And Winifred said to me, look, you've got to learn something about your faith. And she enrolled me in the Good Samaritan program at Glebe, and I did my first studies religion, and it was such an eye-opener. Such an eye-opener. I had this schoolboy faith, and suddenly I was exposed back in the early 80s to the scriptures and exposed to theology and so on. So it's not just backing them, it's then saying, well, how am I going to form this person, and how am I really going to take them somewhere? Okay, we had a few hands for number 3. What about number 4? Number 4. Yes, discover the altar of the unknown God. It's such a challenge with our staff to find the entry points because they're like kids. They're all over the shop. And we know with our young teachers that most of them haven't been in part of the regular worshipping community, and yet they're still quite, you know, they are Catholics, but But there's a depth there, there's a faith there, and we've got to find the entry point to have the discussion. And what about marker 5? Anyone pick marker 5? Oh, there's a few hands for that too. I'll keep that one in. Introduce the boss's son. The Cardinal will be pleased that he got a mention. Okay, let's move on. 5 more markers to go. Let's test these ones out and see how they speak to you. Marker 6 I call embracing mystery. When we were in Rome, I visited the Basilica of St. Mary of the Angels and the Martyrs, and I was speaking to a principal here who's the principal of St. Mary of the Angels, and I said, well, hang on, you've left out the other little bit, you know, what happened to the Martyrs? And of course, you know, in the early church, the first saints were all martyrs. You only got called a saint if you got your head lopped off or you got burned at the stake or something like that. Thank goodness they've changed the rules since then. But visited the Basilica of the St. Mary of the Angels, didn't know a lot about it, and I was really quite surprised when I went into the Basilica. There was an incredible area and display and almost like a little museum on Galileo. And in a little croft area out the back, they had the picture, or this beautiful new sculpture of Galileo as the divine man. And a lot of the exhibition was this tension that had happened in the church between the scientific vision of somebody like Galileo and the church's reaction to that. And I loved the little quote that I put up there, that Monsignor Ravsi, who you know, Galileo got really harshly criticised by the Inquisition, as you know, and confined to house arrest and so on. And afterwards, Monsignor Ravsi started to promote his cause. And the comment was, it's necessary to study the stones to discover the Creator's imprints. It's necessary to study the stones to discover the Creator's imprints. It is so important, if we're going to develop the spirituality of our next generation of teachers, that we help them encounter and understand mystery. I make a point when I speak to the beginning teachers at their first retreat day that I speak at. I give a bigger talk on Catholic pedagogy, but the heart of the talk is, how do you encounter mystery? Because we are a pilgrim people. We don't have all the answers. We don't have to be Catholics but we are Catholics too. We are journeying to things that we don't fully understand. And how do we live comfortably with the mystery? I remember when I first started developing teaching strategies and use high order thinking in religious education, and I presented it at ACU at a seminar, and one of my colleagues came up to me afterwards and said, you know, you're a bit radical getting kids to think about religious education. You don't value your day job very much. You know, there was this culture within our church that we didn't want the kids to think about their faith. My goodness, they might think something that was heretical. And what I'm saying to these young teachers is, faith is mystery. We don't have all the answers. And we have to be comfortable with that. And so how do we prepare these future desert travellers to live comfortably with mystery? And I say to them, it's a bit like everyone in this room I know would have a very close and deep devotion to Eucharist. And yet scientifically and logically it makes no sense that some bread and wine we truly believe is the body and blood of Jesus. And it's the heart of our Mass. We have to actually take some time to help them understand that, you know, and it was really highlighted by that debate the Cardinal had with Dawkins. You know, you can, in encountering mystery, you can start with a scientific approach. Big bang, whatever you want to have. And science, and Galileo really challenged the church in this. He was asking the where, the what, the how sort of questions. And they were really important. But what science isn't very good at is answering the why questions. You know, why is there a universe? Now, Dawkins would contend it's by random chance. But many mathematicians would say the chance of our human world being created in this way is something like 1 to the 10th 40 power. You know, 10 times 10 times 10. You know, like the chance of us being some random act of matter is so small that we can't even possibly comprehend it. And so if you look at mystery as, well, it could have been chance or it could have been some intelligence, then the next question as you encounter mystery is, well, how do we encounter that intelligence? Is it a loving intelligence? Is it a compassionate intelligence? Is it a forgiving intelligence? Because, as I say to these young kids, every civilization in human history at some point in its journey has a spiritual dimension. There is not a civilization that's existed that hasn't asked the why question that's beyond our human comprehension. We have to create the opportunities and the support for these people to know that they are the pilgrims encountering mystery. The seventh marker was one that I didn't know about until I went on the pilgrimage, and yet it made sense. Do you know that out of all the letters Paul wrote to the Ephesians and the Thessalonians and so on, even though he spent a whole lot of time in Athens, there's no letters to the Athenians? Even though it had the famous speech where he preached the full story of Jesus, just about, no Christian community started in Athens while all these other little communities all over the place flourished. And then we went to Corinth, and you know, Corinth was a port town. It was a pretty rough and tumble sort of place. It was the sort of place where, you know, humanity was at its best and its worst. You know, there was prostitution, there was, you know, for want of a better word, drugs, gambling, you know, slavery, whatever the worst of humanity was there, but it was also the best of it. And what it was, the difference when you read St. Paul's work, you look at the Acts and then you look at why was he successful in Corinth, but he didn't cut the mustard in Athens. Because in Corinth, he preached the crucified Christ. It was almost a ridiculous proposition. In a society where their gods were up there, to preach about a God who in human terms would have been seen as a total failure. But to a broken community, the crucified Christ meant something. To the Athenian community, he didn't preach about Christ, the crucified Christ. So everything else, he tried to win the Athenians over with philosophy. Didn't work. What won the Corinthians over was the grounded reality. And he lived with them for 18 months, worked with them for 18 months, and left a very flourishing community. And so in that sense, what's our role in terms of staff formation? Because, you know, one of the things that the Corinthians did struggle with, you know, Paul would go away and they'd get into subgroups, you know, I'm for Apollo and I'm for Cephas and I'm for that. And Paul writes back to them, you know, the Corinthians were a pretty bit of a rabble. You know, he had to write back to them a number of times and, you know, give them a few straight instructions. And he writes back, he said, you can't have I'm for Paul and I'm for Cephas or Peter or whatever. He said, I am for Christ. There's only one person. It's Christ. And it's the crucified Christ. one of the tensions sometimes I have principals talk to me about is we need a charism in our school, and we can be an Edmund Rice school or we can be a De La Salle school or whatever. And I think charisms are really important. But the charism is only important if it's pointing to Christ. If it becomes a thing in its own entity, I don't think we're forming our people very well. And I think we've got to be pretty unequivocal in our leadership that that it's the Christ that we believe in is the Christ that makes the sacrifices. I often use this as an example because it's one of my favourite scripture stories. We all know the story of the prodigal son. It's the best known story in the world, the story of the prodigal son. What people don't know about that story, and I often teach it when I'm doing scripture work, is that little bit where the father sees the son coming up the road, after the son decides to come back and be forgiven. And the father spots the son from the village and he races out to meet him. Now, I've always heard that story of the father who just loved the son so much, he just wanted to embrace him. Wasn't it a warm, fuzzy feeling? You get that picture of the father doing that. But when you study the culture of the time, you learn that there's a certain ceremony called a kazaza ceremony that the Jews have. And in that ceremony, somebody who totally disgraces the community, and in this case the prodigal son had made the ultimate mistake of selling his father's property to Gentiles. And when somebody is totally excluded from a Jewish community, they have a kazaza ceremony where they get an effigy of the person, they take it out to the village gates, they burn the effigy, they get an earthenware, one of those big earthenware pots, and they smash it as a sign that this relationship is totally destroyed. And that person can never, ever return to that community. And if they try to, they'd be stoned to death. And when I learned that, I then had this realization that the father, the God image in the prodigal son, he didn't race down just because he was happy to see his son and embrace him. He raced out of the village because he put his arm around his son, put the coat on him, and walked him up to the village gate and looked them in the eye and said, "You stone him, you have to stone me first." We preach the crucified Christ. We preach a Christ that gives everything. And we have to help our staff know that this isn't just some sugar-coated religion that we have, and we've got to live it in reality, whether it's to the disadvantaged, the marginalised, when all the staff whinge about taking on that next special ed kid, all of those things. Well, what's our marker? Are we really nurturing people that understand the crucified Christ? And bit in the same way is marker 8. And I've called it don't add and don't subtract. And I've touched on this a couple of times earlier. But essentially, I think one of the challenges of Catholicism generally, and for leaders in Catholic circles, is that we have this great tension that when the secular world is challenging the religious world, we try to downplay our religious beliefs. So, we try to accommodate, and this is what our young people are doing, that, well, it's okay. If you believe that, that's okay. You believe that, that's okay. And we downplay it. Give you an example. How many of us have written very strongly in our school newsletters about the situation with refugees? Really challenged our parents. And, some of our communities, I know, have been very, very anti the whole thing. How many of us have got the courage to say, well, the Christian view on refugees is this? We had it last night. What an example of a refugee family that wouldn't be here in 2012 if we let the political winds of today blow. We've got to challenge all of that. But in challenging the norms, we can't add and we can't subtract. We can't downplay our faith, but it's not up to us to accommodate either. You know, one of the challenges in my mind, and this is sort of real in terms of family, is something like in vitro fertilisation. You know, we know families desperate for children really look to in vitro as part of their solution. And then we read something in a church journal that says, no, the church's point about in vitro is, you know, not to support it and so on. And you get caught between the human and the religious. And you sort of want to accommodate, don't you? You want to say, and yet we don't always understand why the church actually teaches about in vitro. And a lot of it, and there's a whole lot of reasons, so I won't try and go into the whole lot, but one of the main reasons, as I say to young teachers, one of the main reasons the church teaches against in vitro is what happens to all the other embryos that are fertilised and washed away in the process. You know, that's only one, there's other arguments. But, you know, like, we have a responsibility in nurturing this next generation to help them be really fully formed in what Catholic teaching is, and not just be the skim on the surface. And so part of it is, like, I've used the Council of Ephesus there, where we went to the church, we stood in the ruins, we had a talk, and, you know, we realised that one of the big, really big issues in the early church was the divinity of Christ. Was he truly God and truly man? Because if we believe Christ is the absolute essence and we believe Christ is only human, well, that takes you one way. If you believe he was only divine, it takes you another way. But the Council of Ephesus, after much debate, came to that thing, that Jesus was both God and man. And our responsibility is to teach with authenticity the teachings of our church. And that's why I loved it at Assisi, that St. Francis was very, why I suppose I'm so passionate about St. Francis, is that he just cut to the chase. It was really simple. You know, he put 2 doors on every one of his churches. And I never understood why. But the 2 doors was just a metaphor to say, this is the divinity of God. You walk through one door, you're understanding his divine nature. Walk through the other door, it's the human nature. You walk, you know, but each time you enter this church, there's a little lesson about a central plank of the faith. And I think that's one of the tough ones for us. I know it's tough when I'm teaching particularly younger teachers, because they're trying to assimilate everything the secular world is challenging our faith on. And there's a whole range of moral and ethical issues, as you know. Okay, marker 9, challenge the silversmiths. Every school has some silversmiths in it. You know, the famous bit from the Acts, where Paul's in Ephesus, and the silversmiths get really, really angry because Paul's talking to them about not worshipping idols and false gods, and the silversmiths were making a fortune out of making beautiful little figurines of Artemis, you know, the god of the hunt and wild animals and virginity and fertility, and people would come especially to Ephesus to buy these beautiful statuettes made in silver. And, well, to be honest, Paul was ruining their business. They weren't happy. And so in the amphitheatre, there was almost a riot. There was people protesting everywhere. And when I first heard the story, I thought it was Paul that went to the amphitheatre. But actually, it was a couple of Paul's apostles that were called into the amphitheatre. They wouldn't let Paul face them. But what struck me was, when you read the story in the Acts, was what we'd call the town clerk, or the mayor of the town. The people were about to riot. They were incensed. And they get up, and the town clerk, who I'm now, in my metaphor, is saying is like the school principal, you know, challenge, and then he settled them down and said, look, let's just keep this in perspective here. You know, this isn't the way we solve problems. This isn't the way we behave as a community. You know, people have got freedom to have their own opinions, etc., etc. One of the things I've found that really impede my leadership sometimes when I was a principal was trying to accommodate the lowest common denominator on staff. You know, you'd want to have a staff spirituality day and there was always one or two people that whinged, you know, or if you thought we might want to go overnight somewhere, oh, you know, and am I going to get paid extra for it? You know, like, and so sometimes you got a bit beaten down by it, you know, like even whinge about 5 minutes of staff prayer or having a turn at prayer or whatever it was. There's no easy solution, but I think we've got to draw a little bit from those early desert travellers and say, look, we've got to have a bit of courage here. We've got to be very clear on our vision about how we're nurturing staff formation. Yes, differentiate it. Yes, try and meet people where they are. But, you know, I was a member of a spirituality team for a while back in my Parramatta days. And, you know, I'd go to some staff groups and we want to plan the staff development day. Oh, we just want a gentle day, a bit of meditation, a bit of a bushwalk. Oh, look, can we finish by 2:30? You know, like it's really not important. And I'd go, oh. And so, you know, where are we really if we let the silversmiths run the city? Because we won't have Catholic schools if we don't really stand very fast and you know, counteract that. And number 10. I always love the Thessalonians because they were like my children. When you read the Thessalonians, they're always wanting to know, you know, like all the Christian community, early Christian communities, they really wanted to know when Jesus was coming back. When was the second coming? And so constantly, one of the things you've got to realise when you read the letters of St. Paul is that there was a two-way dialogue going on. You know, like we only hear the other side of it, but there were people from the community writing to Paul. And so he's writing back to them. It's a two-way thing. And so sometimes you've got to put yourself into the letter to say, oh, this is a response to that. And I could almost hear the Thessalonians saying, are we there yet? Inspiring a radical minority in our staff. Inspiring that critical mass of staff that are going to take our Catholic schools through to the next generation once we all sign off in our super forms out the back, is a long-term project. At the last night of our pilgrimage, I asked the coordinator, could I have the last word? You know, we had the speeches. And when I was speaking to the 40-odd teachers, I said, do you realise we've invested, the Catholic system, we've invested $400,000 to have you go on this pilgrimage. 400,000. We could have employed 5 extra teachers for 400,000. What return are we going to get on our investment? Now, if it was national partnerships and smarter schools and all of those sort of things, they'd have the evaluators out next week, you know, checking, ticking off lists, giving reports back to government. This is intangible stuff. We don't know. But as I said to them, I expect that the results are 20 to 30 years down the track. I talked earlier about my early formation with the Good Sams. Very sadly, one of the most influential people in my life, and yet she never knew it, died last year, Sister Verna Hollyhead. Fabulous scripture scholar. And I can't help thinking now that Verna invested something that hopefully 30 years later is bearing some fruit. So we'll never be there, we know that. But are we at either a system level or at a school level prepared to invest real resources in getting us along the journey? I used to have the poster in my office, you know, that one where you come to the divide in the two roads, and the question is, you know, do you trust the unknown future in a known God? We are so lucky that we are not totally reliant on government control. We have the power, if you like, to make the decisions to invest in our next generation of leaders. We just have to have the courage. We have to change the priority sometimes from the urgent and the immediate. Yes, I'm speaking to a group of parents next week about special needs children, and they'll be at me, you know, flat out for more money for the immediate need of that child. But if we lift the reading level of that special needs child and we don't nurture their spirituality, I don't think we've really succeeded in educating the whole child. Can I just bring this little session to conclusion? I hope that today I've taken you on a bit of a journey. I hope I've prodded and provoked a little bit. But I hope also that in sharing with you those 10 markers, they're not all relevant to your context, but there might be one or two of them that every now and then, in the busyness of your work as Catholic leaders, you can look up on the hill when you're feeling a little bit lost and say, well, how do we reset our direction? And how do we remind ourselves that one of our greatest challenges is making sure that in 30 years' time, there's a group of Catholic educators as well-formed and as passionate as ourselves. And so by way of conclusion, I'm really, really impressed by St. Paul writing to the Philippians. As he said, thank God for the Philippians. They were a true radical minority. They got it right. Out of all Paul's letters, when you see him writing, generally he's giving one group or another a little bit of a touch-up. You know, he's reminding them to stay on track. But apart from a very minor reference in the Philippians, you know, they got it right. They were a community that really had Jesus as the centre, and the way they related to each other was incredibly beautiful. And it was interesting that even though Paul got put in jail there in Philippi, when the earthquake happened and he could have escaped, he didn't, because he knew that the jailer would have been punished if they had walked away. He just placed his trust in God. But one of my favourite quotes always from the Philippians is that one that we sing so often, you know, I thank my God each time I think of you, and when I pray for you, I pray for joy. Folks, I think this is a unique opportunity as an Executive Director of Catholic Schools to speak on behalf of my colleague directors, to say what an absolute privilege it is to have colleagues such as you, our Philippians, people that truly are committed to this journey. And so it is true that when I think of you, I pray with joy. Thanks very much.